Hello and welcome to this webinar on the IEA World Energy Outlook. It's one of a series of webinars that we are doing for the new publication which was released on the 14th of November. Many thanks for the interest in this webinar. We can see that many people are on the line. My name is Tim Gould. I'm head of the Energy Supply Outlooks division here at the IEA, and I'm joined by three other colleagues. Firstly, Laura Cozzi, who's head of division for the energy demand outlooks, and between us we have the World Energy Outlook team of around 40 people that produce the outlook, the series of outlook publications every year. We're also joined by two colleagues that played a pivotal role in the analysis that we will be discussing today. This is Timur Gül and Christophe McGlade. We have around 1 hour for this webinar, and we'll be dividing the time in two. Firstly, a presentation of key findings relating to the Sustainable Development Scenario in this year's Outlook, and then we will move to answering your questions. We have some questions in already. You're very welcome to submit additional questions as we go along through the browser for this webinar. Slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on our website after the event. I think it's worth starting with a word about the way that we put this World Energy Outlook together. And this is scenario-based analysis. So the scenario that is often discussed is the new policy scenario, which gives us an indication of the direction in which the world's energy system is heading. So that incorporates today's policy frameworks, today's technology developments, and announced intentions such as those in the pledges made under the Paris Agreement. So as I mentioned, that describes the way that we're heading. That direction, though, is not consistent with many of the shared global goals that have been agreed. And we're going to be talking today about the gap that remains between that main scenario and the scenario, another scenario, which we're calling the Sustainable Development Scenario, that is consistent with those goals. And for the inspiration for the Sustainable Development Scenario, we've derived from the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda. And so we looked at the energy-related components of that agenda and tried to put in place a strategy, a pathway towards meeting them. Three components to that, which we'll be talking about today. That's determined action on climate change consistent with the Paris Agreement. That's moving towards a system where everyone on the planet has access to modern energy. And it's also about a dramatic reduction in the pollutants that cause poor air quality. As we shall see, we're making progress on all of these fronts, but there's a lot of unfinished business. And with that, I pass the word on to my colleague Laura.
So thank you very much, Tim. So this year, one of the main innovations of the World Energy Outlook has really been the introduction of, indeed, a new scenario, which we call a Sustainable Development Scenario. This is not something that we do every year. We do not introduce new scenarios on a yearly basis. It has been quite a while, nearly a decade, since we didn't have an introduction of a new scenario. And this really wants to mark the taking into action and the approval within the United Nations framework of the 2030 Agenda. And we'll come back to that. One of the main objectives of the World Energy Outlook, as Tim mentioned, is really to track policy progress. And we do that through the new policy scenario. We don't stop our work there. We identify where policy gaps are and how we can direct policymakers to fill those gaps. If we start to where we are today, we certainly understand that energy is the blood life of all economies throughout the world, developed and developing economies. But on the other hand, energy production in use is linked to a wide range of issues, including environmental aspects. On three fronts, we see recent progress going in the following direction. First of all, if we look at CO2 emissions for the past 3 years, we have seen rather a flat line with 3 years of CO2 emissions being flat. We are also seeing very clearly a link between combustion, so energy being combusted, and this being linked to premature deaths due to respiratory disease globally. Air pollution being considered the 4th largest cause of premature death globally, and energy use being really at the heart of these premature deaths. Finally, our Energy Access Outlook that was released less than a month ago has undertaken a major country-by-country analysis and assesses that still we have 1.1 billion people that do not have access to electricity, and importantly, 2.8 billion people that do not have access to clean cooking. As mentioned earlier, at the end of 2015, while the Paris Agreement was being adopted, at the same time, a very large number of countries, over 190, actually adopted the UN Sustainable Development Goals. What are those? Those are goals that are really touching upon all aspects of human life and provide a vision for the world to move towards a more sustainable planet in 2030. Many of those goals are directly or indirectly linked to energy use. Let's take, for example, quality of education. Currently in sub-Saharan Africa, there are around 90 million kids that go to schools that don't have electricity. This clearly hampers their ability to study, and the fact that they don't have lights when they go back home hampers their ability to study actually after the sun has gone down. Similarly, on gender, energy is also a big component of gender equality. The fact that we have today nearly half of the population that still really uses biomass to cook is very poorly understood, but it hampers the development of women and the gender equality. Why? On average, we estimate that women need to use around 2.5 hours a day to go and collect biomass. We are estimating around 50 kilos of biomass that they are to put on their heads, with a very significant burden for their health, and another 4 hours for cooking. So you have basically the equivalent of 6 hours a day for a large majority of women in the developing world that are used and devoted to energy-related chores that could be used otherwise if there was an affordable alternative available for them. There are 3 elements that are very, very clearly linked to energy. The first is SDG 3 on good health and well-being. That again links to energy. Why? Links to energy through local pollution in cities, and pollution in households when we are burning unsustainable biomass. There is, for the first time, and this is a major breakthrough that occurred within the UN 2030 agenda, for the first time there is a separate SDG on energy. That's a major achievement. It was not the case in the Millennium Development Goals. And this is marked very clearly with clear sentences: ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. It's important to underline that those targets are true and subscribed by developed and developing countries alike. This is not only a development problem, it's a problem that touches upon all of us. Finally, very clearly, climate action: 2/3 of CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions related to burning of fossil fuels, and action on the energy sector being central in achieving the Paris Agreement. So where would the new policy scenario lead us? The new policy scenario would lead us to an increase in energy use, mostly concentrated in the developing world. And within the developing world, we're seeing Asia as being the place where more of the new energy demand will come from. Which type of energy are we going to use going forward? It's more and more cleaner. So low carbon technologies alone will account for 50% of new energy needs. Natural gas, another 35%. It makes 85% just devoted to natural gas and clean energy. And the rest being coal and oil. Are we satisfied with this outcome? Would we be able to meet the SDG goals by 2030 if we were to follow what policies, the policies that we have on our books today? Well, let's take in turn each of the three elements, and the answer is going to be a very clear no. First of all, if you look at CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions, as we said earlier, have stalled for the past 3 years. We think that this is not permanent. Emissions are going to rise again. They're not going to rise very much. It's around 0.2% a year. But this is completely insufficient to reach our climate goals, where we actually need to peak and decline emissions as soon as possible. Where is this growth coming from? I think it's important to note that the growth is coming from places in terms of sectors and fuels that were not the usual suspects. We always tend to pinpoint coal use in power generation as being the largest source of pollution. What we're seeing very clearly is that oil use in transport is fast approaching the levels of coal use in power, while we see coal use in power generation flattening out. So it's important to direct our attention to the new sources of growth, oil in the transport sector being one, transport, trucks, aviation and shipping, and on the other hand, gas, which is much cleaner in terms of intensity of emissions than coal and oil, but is growing very quickly, where we are pointing the attention to methane emissions, and my colleague Christoph McLeod will come back to this in a second. So on the CO2 emissions front, on SDG 13, we are not on track. What about health? What about the component of energy used towards achieving a better life in our cities and a better health? Are we on track? Well, clearly the simple answer is no, despite the fact that we are seeing emissions of each of the pollutants in all major countries going down. This is not an easy story to tell, but as citizens of the world age and move to cities more and more, their exposure to pollutants increases, and therefore the health impact on premature health deaths for us is on the rise. So in China, in India, and in Southeast Asia, where already we are having significant premature deaths in cities. The Delhi example of today is a very clear one, where it's very visible, and kids are not going to school those days because of the pollution in Delhi. This is not going to get better. It's going to get worse. So for what concerns SDG 3, and in particular 3.7, the message is still clear. We are not on track. Third point, SDG 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable energy for all. Are we on track? So what we're seeing is that India has made tremendous progress over the past few years, but still we have 240 million people not having access to electricity in India. Most of the new connections in India actually occurred through grid. Other Asia as well, a lot of progress. Sub-Saharan Africa, over the past 2 years, for the first time, we are seeing a decline in the number of people without access to electricity going forward. So good news for India and most places in other Asia. Yes, we are on track to achieve electricity access for all by 2030, but Sub-Saharan Africa lags behind. We're still nearly having 600 million people not having access to electricity. Most people stop here. There is another lag on this access to energy problem, which is the cooking one that we mentioned earlier. Over 2.8 billion people will still not have access to clean cooking, do not have access to clean cooking today, and around the same number will not have access to clean cooking in 2030. So again, on the SDG 7, we are not on track. So if we look at policies as they are today, we cannot claim ourselves satisfied. So we wanted to go a step beyond and give our policymakers a sense of direction of where we should be going, what kind of levers we need to push more to get in the right direction. And Timo Wool will now explain you how we did this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Laura. The picture that Laura Cosi was just explaining is a bit mixed, if you like. We're seeing significant progress in many areas, a slowdown in CO2 emissions growth, a decline in air pollutant emissions in many countries, and progress in many countries towards achieving universal access by 2030. But the problem is far from being solved. People are still dying prematurely from the impacts of air pollution. We are not achieving even the most fundamental that you require for any low temperature target for the long term, which is a peak in emissions in the near future. And we are not achieving universal access for all by 2030 in all countries on the planet. But what we wanted to do in this year's World Energy Outlook is not to stop assessing where we're heading, but also try to understand and try to provide a pathway how to solve that problem. Those of you who've been following the World Energy Outlook over the past couple of years will know that we have been active, obviously, in the various different fields that we've been discussing in isolation. So we had a scenario that we referred to as the 450 scenario, which was meant to help address climate change. We have been working on identifying pathways to achieving universal access to modern energy services by 2030, such as in our most recent Energy Access Outlook that was just released a couple of weeks ago, and we've been active in this field for more than 1.5 decades. And we have also been looking into pathways to improve air quality, most recently in our 2016 World Energy Outlook Special Report on energy and air pollution in the context of a clean air scenario. What is new in this year's World Energy Outlook is clearly that we have tried to come up with an integrated approach towards solving those three key challenges that the energy sector is facing for the short as well as for the longer term. It is called the Sustainable Development Scenario, and this is sort of our input towards the discussion under the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda. Now, what it requires from the energy sector is obviously significant changes, and those of you who have attended our earlier webinar will have seen some of this discussion before. The energy sector needs to be twice as efficient than it already is today, and this number might not sound very big in many ways, but if you look behind what it actually means, it is much bigger than it actually sounds. You basically need, for example, 30% less energy per ton of aluminium produced, 25% less energy per ton of steel produced. A conventional car needs to consume half the amount of fuel used for driving than it does today. For moving a good or ton of goods by a truck, you basically are supposed to use half the energy that you're using today, and you need 40% less electricity for appliances such as TVs or home computers. What the scenario also sees is an increase in gas demand. It does see peaks in other fossil fuel demands, in particular coal, obviously, and oil. My colleague Christoph will be talking about this in a couple of minutes. For natural gas, what is really important in this scenario is that the gas industry does its homework when it comes to methane leakage, and this will also be presented in a couple of minutes. A good example for the transport sector is certainly the expansion of electric cars that is required. We are talking about nearly 900 million electric vehicles that are on the road in 2040 in this sustainable development scenario, which is roughly 3 times the level that we are achieving under current and planned policies, and it's up from roughly 2 million cars that are on the road today. And also in the power sector, this is just an illustrative number of the changes that are required in the power sector. You're talking about more than 3,000 gigawatts of solar PV capacity by the year 2040, 50% more than what we are seeing under existing and planned policies. So it requires, what this scenario really requires is an additional step change in the pace of delivering a clean energy transition over and above what we are achieving under existing and planned policies. Now, let me continue, or let me rest for a moment on the power sector. I think it's a good example for the change that is required. If you just remember yourself where we are heading under existing and planned policies, we are talking about a share of low carbon technologies in the generation mix of roughly 35% today. This is increasing under existing and planned policies to 50% by the year 2040. In the sustainable development, we need a stronger emphasis on deploying low carbon technologies, in particular renewables, which make up more than 60% of power generation by the year 2040. The total increases to 85% low carbon technologies by the year 2040. With this, I'll hand over for a couple of comments from Christoph on the changes that are required or what it implies for fossil fuel demand moving forward.
Thanks, Timo. So, as we've already heard in the past number of years, the demand for all of the fossil fuels has been rising, and under the new policy scenario, we see a continuation of that, albeit the pace of that rising is different between the different fossil fuels. But under the sustainable development scenario, we see a very different picture emerging. So by 2040, coal demand is around half the level it is today, and oil demand is around about 25% lower than it is today. But as Timo mentioned, the trajectory for gas is a little bit different. Up to around about 2025, we don't actually see there being a huge difference between gas consumption in the sustainable development scenario from the new policy scenario. But after 2025, gas demand starts to flatten and plateau. And as a result of the declines that there are in coal and oil, this means that gas overtakes coal in the global energy mix in the mid-2020s, and it overtakes oil in the mid-2030s, so that by 2040, gas is the single largest fossil fuel that we consume. Of course, it's important to remember that the combustion of gas does still result in substantial levels of carbon dioxide and also NOx emissions. And so the opportunities for gas are naturally much more constrained in the sustainable development scenario than the new policy scenario. However, the characteristics of natural gas relative to the other fossil fuels mean that it can continue to make an important part and play an important role in the decarbonization strategies of many different regions. And this is especially the case in countries who currently have a high carbon intensity, and in those sectors and applications where low carbon alternatives are either unavailable at scale or are likely to be less cost effective. So in the sustainable development scenario, the share of coal in the energy mix of all regions falls over time. But the picture for gas is a bit more complex. And while we see gas grow at a global level, this masks a number of important and major differences that we see between the different regions around the world. For example, in some regions, such as the Middle East and in Russia, who currently have low levels of coal consumption today and who currently have quite high levels of gas consumption, we see their level of gas consumption and the share of gas in their energy mixes falling throughout the sustainable development scenario. And this indicates that in these regions, the role of gas is relatively limited in helping to achieve the energy sector transition. Secondly, there's more developing gas markets, more emerging gas markets, where coal consumption is currently much higher. And there's also the possibility that coal consumption will continue to rise going forwards. In the sustainable development scenario, gas use rises steadily in these regions over the period to 2040, and it makes a sustained contribution towards achieving decarbonizing the energy system, reducing air pollution in these regions, and also helping to achieve universal energy access. And this is both by avoiding the need to build new coal power plants and new coal-fired boilers, and also by helping to integrate the rapidly rising levels of renewables that we see in these regions. And finally, there's some regions and countries that lie in the middle of these two extremes. And in these regions, we see the share of gas in our energy mix increasing for a certain period before it starts to then decline in later years. And this suggests that gas in these regions has the potential to make quite an important contribution the transition, but that this is strictly time limited. So why does this happen? Well, in these regions, they currently have a large, well-developed gas grid, lots of gas infrastructure such as gas power plants that can be used. And in order to meet the goals of the sustainable development scenario, there's a need to displace coal generation as quickly as is possible. And this means that as coal consumption is falling rapidly between 2016 and 2025, even though we see a rapid rise in the levels of renewables that are deployed in these regions, there's still some gap that needs to be met. And gas can form a very important part in offsetting some of the loss of generation from coal-fired power plants while we see this rise in renewables. However, it's important to recognize that the opportunity for gas in these regions is time limited. After 2025, with coal increasingly removed from the electricity mix and from the power systems in these regions, and with an ever-increasing CO2 price, the tide turns against the use of gas-fired generation to provide baseload support, baseload electricity supply, and the utilization rates of gas-fired power plants drops in both Europe and the United States. And overall, we see a drop in the level of gas in their energy mixes. One overarching element that's required for gas to play the role that's been outlined here in all of the regions is the need to tackle methane emissions from oil and gas operations. Methane emissions that occur during the production, processing, and transport of natural gas need to be eliminated as far as is possible. And this is something that we looked at in detail in the World Energy Outlook. On a global basis, we estimate that there's around about 76 million tons of methane that's emitted each year from oil and gas operations. And because methane is a potent greenhouse gas, these emissions threaten some of the climate benefits that can be conveyed from coal to gas switching. So what can be done about these 75 million tons of emissions? What we show here is the marginal abatement cost curve for reducing methane emissions. And so by moving from left to right along the horizontal axis of this curve, we can see the levels of abatement that is possible in different regions, with the costs of the abatement or the savings that result from that abatement given on the vertical axis. And an important aspect to bear in mind with these methane emissions reductions is that since methane is a valuable product, that can therefore be recovered. If any methane that is recovered can be sold, and this means that deploying certain abatement technologies can result in overall savings if the value of the methane sold is greater than the cost of the technology. And in total, we estimate that out of the 76 million tons of methane emissions from oil and gas operations, around about 3/4, or just under 60 million tons, could technically be avoidable. And while around about 40 to 50% of the emissions that there currently are, around about 40 million tons, can be avoided just by using technologies and approaches that pay for themselves, in a sustainable development scenario, we need to go beyond just these measures. In the sustainable development scenario, we assume that all of the technically available options and measures are deployed so that methane emissions in 2040 are around about 20 million tons, 3/4 lower than what they would have been in the absence of any efforts to reduce these emissions. And the failure to bring about these reductions would have very serious implications for long-term climate change. In terms of the temperature rise, the difference between tackling methane emissions and not tackling methane emissions in a sustainable development scenario is broadly equivalent to the warming that would result from emitting an additional 140 billion tons of CO2 over the remainder of the century. And this is an absolutely huge difference, especially in the context of the decarbonisation efforts that are already necessary in the scenario. And I'll just finish by highlighting one important point, and that is, despite the need to reduce CO2 emissions from the energy mix in a sustainable development scenario, and therefore the lower levels of fossil fuel consumption there are in a scenario, it remains critical to advance methane emissions reductions policies, as these will still have a major impact upon the long-term temperature rise. And with that, I'll hand it back to Timo.
Thank you very much, Christoph. So let me just quickly summarize or remind ourselves again about the energy sector implications that we are talking about. We're talking about a peak in coal demand before 2020. We're talking about a peak in oil demand soon thereafter, and a moderate increase in gas demand moving forward if the gas industry is making its homework. We're talking about a 50% increase of solar PV capacity by the year 2040 over and above what we're already achieving under planned policies, and a tripling, for example, of electric cars by the year 2040. Now, what does this scenario achieve? I mean, there's a lot of energy sector change that is happening, and let me work through the three different elements that this scenario is supposed to be achieving. So addressing climate change, improving air quality, and achieving universal access by the year 2030. If I start with climate change, then what the scenario does is, if this depicts your energy and process-related CO2 emissions, it achieves two of the three main pillars of the Paris Agreement, which is a near-term peak in energy and process-related CO2 emissions or overall greenhouse gas emissions, and a rapid decline thereafter. What does it mean in terms of temperature moving forward? So this scenario sets you up for achieving important improvement in terms of moderating the temperature growth towards 2100, depending obviously on three things. First, how quickly we achieve the third leg of the Paris Agreement, which is net zero emissions in the second half of the century. It also depends on the fact or on the question whether we are able to go net negative in terms of our emissions in the second half of the century, such as through carbon dioxide removal technologies. And it also depends obviously on what's happening outside the energy sector. If you compare this scenario with the latest scenarios in the IPCC database, then and you compare it to scenarios that are compatible with a temperature rise of 1.7 to 1.8 degrees by the year 2100, then what you see is that this pathway by the year 2040 sits in the lower range of emissions that are compatible with such temperature rises. The second aspect here is that I would like to highlight is on air quality and how the scenario improves air quality in all the countries concerned. As we have shown in the earlier part of this presentation, air pollution remains an important headache for policymakers all around the world under existing and planned policies. And we have done some detailed modeling analysis together with the International Institute of Applied Systems analysis from Austria. What you see here, very nicely illustrated, I think, is the case of China today, how fine particulate matter concentrations spread out over China. What our scenario, our new policy scenario suggests, so under existing and planned policies, is that there are significant improvements triggered by the clean energy transition that China is doing, triggered also by the fact that China is adopting emission standards that are compatible with those in industrialized countries, be it for the power sector or be it for the transport sector or be it for the industry sector. But the problem is still not entirely resolved by the year 2040 in the sustainable development scenarios. With the measures that we are bringing forward here, we are finding significant additional improvements in terms of air quality. Overall, this scenario on a global level achieves the cutting of the premature death as a result of air pollution by the year 2040 by around half. And I would like to highlight here in this context that air pollution is actually a good illustration of why we are choosing such an integrated policy approach. If you just break down how the reductions in fine particulate matter come about in this sustainable development scenario compared with the new policy scenario, then we're roughly talking about 40% reduction that comes from the clean energy transition that is happening in this scenario, roughly 40% that comes from air pollution policies, and the remainder actually coming from achieving universal access for by reducing premature deaths from or fine particulate matter from the use of traditional biomass with coke stoves. Now this leads me over to what this scenario achieves in terms of universal access. Obviously, this scenario by definition achieves universal access by the year 2030, but we didn't try to just say this is what you need to achieve, but what this scenario is also laying out is a detailed strategy actually how to achieve universal access by 2030. We did that using geospatial modeling techniques together with the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, where we try to look into the availability of networking infrastructure, technology progress and costs, the availability of local resources, population density, distribution of demand growth, and so on, in order to understand what kind of technology solutions, what kind of network solutions are those that are important in the way to achieve universal access. And what we find is that of the 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, that achieve electricity access by the year 2030, roughly 150 additional million compared to the new policy scenario do that via grid extension, in particular fueled by hydro. The majority of connections that occurs in this scenario under the assumptions of the sustainable development scenario comes actually from decentralized solutions, which become more important. In fact, renewables supply the majority of additional numbers of people that are getting access to 2030. 450 million people in rural areas are using decentralized solutions moving forward. What we would like to highlight in this is two things. First of all, the additional investment numbers are not unsurmountable. We are talking about an additional $26 billion per year that are required over and above what we are already investing under the assumptions of the new policy scenario. But what is also increasingly important, or very important to highlight, is the fact that the strategy that we are bringing forward here is practically greenhouse gas neutral towards 2030 and doesn't hamper. So basically what we're saying is achieving universal access by 2030 doesn't hamper achieving climate goals. What does this scenario require on the investment side of things? If you look into where we are investing money on the energy supply side of things, the majority of investment currently goes into fossil fuels. What we require is not a step change in terms of additional investments in energy supply, but what it really requires is a reorientation of investments towards renewables and transmission and distribution networks in particular, but also obviously nuclear and CCS. Where there is a step change in investment that is required is really on the energy demand side of things. We're talking about more efficient appliances, more efficient cars. We're talking about electric cars. We're talking about renewable solutions for heating, be it in industry, be it in the building sector moving forward. The additional investment overall in this scenario is roughly 15% higher but then the amount of investment that is required for achieving our existing and planned policies under the new policy scenario. Let me quickly wrap up the thoughts and what we have been talking about today very briefly, that we are making progress towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, but we are still not on track to fully achieving them under the existing and planned policies. What our strategy really does is it shows that concerted action to address climate can be fully compatible and actually complementary towards achieving goals of universal access and air quality. The strategy that we are proposing achieves universal access in 2030, cuts CO2 emissions by half roughly compared with the new policy scenario, and so does it in terms of premature deaths from air pollution. The Sustainable Development Scenario doesn't require huge amounts of additional investments. I mean, these are obviously big numbers, but compared to what we are already talking about under existing and planned policies, it's not a step change in investment, and obviously we are ready as the IEA to continue to support progress towards achieving this clean energy future with the full range of capabilities that we have in-house. With that, I'll pass the word back to Tim Gould.
Thanks very much, Laura. Thanks very much, Timo and Christoph. You're very welcome to send in questions that we'll attempt to answer. We have around 20 minutes before our hour is up. And thanks very much to those who have already submitted questions, but please keep them coming in. If we run out of time today, then we will get back to you by email. And the first one came in from Mr. Deepak Sharma, who asked, which countries do you foresee taking the lead in following the sustainable development scenario?
So thank you very much, Mr. Sharma. We are tracking policies around the globe, and we, having done the country focus on China this year, there is one policy that is worth really watching very, very closely, and this is called the Energy Production Consumption Revolution that has been put forward by the Chinese government at the end of last year. This revolution really sets in motion a really very deep change within the Chinese energy sector, but it has the implication and the possibilities to actually shape up global energy trends in all the clean energy spectrum. So what we have depicted in our new policy scenario takes into consideration some of the aspects and the ambition of the revolution set out in the Chinese policy, but doesn't consider it fully. So we do see a possibility of an upside in China, moving more quickly, for example, on the electric vehicle space, but also on storage and on a number of other clean energy technologies. So China could be one of the countries where the clean energy transition moves quicker. However, we are also monitoring very closely what's happening in India, and the signs that we see on the ground in India are also promising. So we are seeing tremendous progress being done on the energy access front. India has achieved over the past 6 years an electrification effort of over 500 million people, is one of the largest in history, and we see India being on track of achieving this target of full electrification by the 2020s. So India is also moving quickly, is moving quickly also on the solar space, having doubled the capacity installed. So we do see potential for a number of countries to move quicker than we expect in the new policy scenario.
Thank you very much, Laura. There's a question from Julie about oil and gas demand in this scenario, and I think we covered some of that in the presentation, but an additional element that's come in is related to the debate on stranded assets. So to what extent do the demand scenarios that we've seen in the sustainable development scenario, do they create the risk of stranding upstream or other assets in the oil and gas sector?
So I'll focus mainly on the potential for stranded assets in the oil sector, principally because we have an increase in gas consumption in the sustainable development scenario, and that means that the risk of stranding for the gas industry is potentially lower than it is for the oil industry. And as I mentioned, oil demand peaks soon after 2020 in a sustainable development scenario, and is about 25% lower than today. So it's around about 72 million barrels per day in 2040. And the key point when thinking about stranded assets is that this rate of decline in oil demand, while it is large, is still lower than the rate of decline that we see from existing production. For fields, oil fields, once you drill an oil field, it reaches a peak a few years afterwards and then will slowly start to decline. And when we look across all fields around the world, the average rate of decline for fields is around about 4 to 6% year on year. It varies to some extent between different countries and between different types of fields. And this sets a very important backdrop to stranded assets. The rate of decline in oil demand is only about 1 to 2% per year. And so the rate of decline of demand is lower than the rate of decline in current production. And this means that we actually require continued investment into new sources of production, even in the sustainable development scenario, to ensure that we don't have any mismatch between oil demand and oil supply. Saying that, the risk of stranded assets does increase quite significantly if market participants don't take into account the signals that policymakers send. So if they don't take into account the fact that oil is on a declining trajectory, well, then there's a risk that they might overinvest and there might be some losses. Similarly, if policymakers aren't clear about the impacts of climate policy and don't make it clear to the oil industry, for example, about the temperature rise they want to bring about, there's a risk that there could be some overinvestment. And so where we see there being some real risk of losses is if we follow trajectory, say, following the new policy scenario for around about 5 to 10 years, and then all of a sudden there's a change for whatever reason from the new policy trajectory towards sustainable development trajectory. And then you have a rate of decline of demand which far exceeds the natural decline that you see from fields. And there is a risk that there could be some stranded assets. So on stranded assets, we don't see there being a huge risk in the sustainable development scenario unless there is inconsistent or unclear policymaking, or if the market participants don't take that on board.
Thanks very much. We have a couple of questions here relating to the trajectory for emissions reductions and also in relation to what that might mean for global temperature increase relative to pre-industrial levels. So a question from Mr. Gupta. So what would be the increase in global temperature, not in this scenario, but in the baseline scenario, so in our main new policy scenario? And a question from Greg Mutted. So when designing the sustainable development scenario, why didn't you use the emissions pathway you published in March 2017, aiming for a 66 probability of staying below 2 degrees centigrade Celsius, which would be closer to the Paris goals? Why does that scenario only get 2 to 3 pages in the World Energy Outlook?
So thanks a lot. First of all, where does the new policy scenario lead us in terms of temperature increase? Of course, this very much depends what is the trajectory of emissions post 2040, but our assessment is that we would not be in line with the Paris Agreement, and it would be in the order by 2100 of around 3 degrees. Analysis that we have conducted a year and a half ago was showing around 2.7 degrees, but it may be 0.1, 0.2 points of degrees difference. So anyway, the message is clear, is not on track to meet the Paris Agreement. As far as the other question is concerned, for those colleagues that are listening us that are not familiar with our March publication, in that publication we were exploring an energy sector trajectory that would be complying with the Paris Agreement, but with another condition, which is a strict one, meaning that in this scenario we would not allow any negative emission to occur. So that scenario, which is still featuring in this outlook, and we call it a faster transition scenario, not only meets the Paris Agreement, but does meet the Paris Agreement with an assumption that those technologies would not be available. What we have done this year, and is shown in this graph that my colleague Mr. Gould showed earlier, we are providing a trajectory that is compatible with the agreement. Insofar, there are 3 objectives that are needed to be met. The first one, emissions peak, and in fact in this scenario emissions do not grow over 2016 level. They continue to decline, so they don't resume any growth. So the first requirement of the Paris Agreement, the peak in emission, is achieved. The second, the very steep decline, is also achieved. And the third, which is achieving net negative emission sometime within the second half of this century, is also achieved. The big question is, when is this achieved? And when this is achieved will actually ultimately determine at what levels do we meet the Paris Agreement. So are we going to be around 2 degrees, or are we going to be closer to the ambition of being at 1.5? And this very much depends on the pace of decarbonization post 2040 in critical sectors like industry and buildings, because power is largely decarbonized by then, and transport, and the uptake of negative emissions.
So thanks very much. So we're talking about negative emissions technologies. We're even talking about the possibility of going below that zero line, which would put us into sort of net negative territory, which brings us to the question of CCS. A couple of people are asking about that. So to what extent is the expansion of CCS built into the Sustainable Development Scenario? And does this 15% increase in investment that we refer to in the final slide, does that include the investment in carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture utilization and storage?
Yes, thank you, Tim, and thank you to the colleagues for asking. Now, CCS does play a role in this scenario towards 2040. I think you've probably seen it as part of the power generation slide. It's not a majority of the low carbon technologies here. That's clearly renewables, but it does already play a role. If you compare the trends under our new policy scenario, or the CO2 emission trends under our new policy scenario, with those under the Sustainable Development Scenario, and you ask yourself where the savings are coming from, then it's just under 10% of these emission savings that are coming from CCS. This is not necessarily related to the scale alone, but also to the fact that there's hardly any of the deployment, or very limited deployment, under new policies. The investment requirements are obviously part of the earlier graph. What this technology does is, in fact, two things. It reduces the cost of the transformation of the energy sector in some countries. Concerned for some countries where, for example, the expansion in the coal-fired power fleet was significant in recent years, such as China, it can be an important asset. It's very important in the industry sector, in particular for process-related emissions as well. And what the deployment of this technology obviously offers is the achievement of more stringent climate goals towards the longer term, lending itself to the possibility of reaching net negative emissions sometime in the second half of the century, if it deployed in conjunction with bioenergy.
Okay, thanks very much for that. So I should have mentioned that those questions came in from Robert Finley and Wilfried Maat. And another question came in from Johanna Spiro Emra about the projections for achieving energy access in Africa. So which countries, or which country in sub-Saharan Africa is leading the way in off-grid energy generation?
Yes, thanks a lot for the question. We're seeing a lot of movement happening in Kenya. This has really become a leader in this space. And what's happening is we are having entrepreneurs and companies, well, Mkopa being one of the clear leader in the segment, that are offering solutions that bring together three innovations. In fact, the first one is on solar, so it takes advantage of the solar cost decline, together with the cost decline in storage. And thirdly, but equally important, the advances in digital finance. So what's happening, this is opening up markets to new customers that before were not necessarily able to pay, and the ability to offer them kits, very often coupled with super efficient appliances that enables even small solar capacity to provide a larger number of energy services, lighting, mobile phones, etc., is opening up pockets of new customers that were not within reach before, and were not within reach with the grid extension. So countries that we're seeing coming up later are those that are not creating unnecessary tariffs for example, for imports of those technologies, and they are creating a good enabling environment also on the digital finance side.
Thanks, Laura. I think we have time for one more question before our hour is up. And this comes on the investment side. So we mentioned in one of the final slides that there's a 15% increase in investment in the sustainable development scenario relative to our new policy scenario. So the question is around, how should we understand that 15% increase? What bit of that additional investment or is going towards the achievement of climate goals? How much is the additional investment for reductions in air pollution, and how much of it indeed for the achievement of energy access or for the universal access?
Thank you. Yeah, an excellent question. I think it's important to realize that to disentangle these kind of investments is a challenge in itself, right? I mean, as we tried to say earlier in the speech, if you look at, for example, the goal of achieving air quality, it is linked to all three elements of this package that we're proposing here, the sustainable development scenario. So in order to achieve cleaner air by the year 2040, you need an energy transition. You need to adopt air pollution measures, and in particular, for what concerns fine particulate matter in households, you also need to invest in or achieve universal access by the year 2030. So it is very difficult to decompose these investments. But if you look at it from a clean energy transition angle, this is the majority of the investment, right? So we are roughly investing $60 trillion towards 2040 under existing and planned policies, and we're talking about $69 trillion roughly for the sustainable development scenario, of which more than $7 trillion go into the clean energy transition, and the remainder is split roughly equal between additional investment in air pollution measures and achieving energy access. So as I said, the fundamentally important thing for all of these various targets here of this clean energy transition, to achieve a clean energy transition, is absorbing the majority of the investment, but the additional investment is also needed for air pollution and energy access in order to achieve the full pathway.
Okay, thanks very much. I think our time is now up. We've had 1 hour. Thanks very much to Laura, to Timo, to Christoph for their presentations and for their answers. Thanks very much to you all for listening in. There are a couple of questions which we will respond to by email, and there's an open invitation if you have other queries about our scenarios or about our work to send these questions across. The email address for the WEO team is weo@iea.org. We look forward to hearing from you, and thanks again for joining today.